independent journalists, different media organizations. So what are your impressions? What are the main issues at this moment in Ukraine to raise for somebody who take care about the freedom of speech representing OSCE?
Well, I think Ukraine is a country where freedom of the speech is respected. There's a lot of diverse media outlets, and I think that Ukrainian people are very much attached to the development of the free media in the country. Nevertheless, I've met a lot of your colleagues and of journalists association, and we are working permanently with watchdogs and advocacy group for media freedom, and we are worrying about certain problems which remains regarding safety of journalists, of course because of impunity. After the crimes against several Ukrainian journalists, I think about the crime against Pavel Sheremet, and the perpetrators and the mastermind have still not been brought to justice. There is also several incidents, and I think there is no minor incident when it's about safety of journalists, and it's very important that the judiciary, the law enforcement, the government, of course, put in place all the necessary policy to ensure that any threats, any attacks against a journalist will be investigated. This is a concern that we have everywhere in the OSCE region.
We currently have there are more, 3 journalists who are detained. We can speak about Roman Sushchenko in Moscow, about Mykola Semena in Crimea, who is on the criminal procedure, and Stanislav Aseyev in a way worse situation in Donetsk. And what the public sees, that even though Russia is a member of OSCE, currently there is very little the international community can do really to have an impact. What you would say to those that, you know...
Yes, of course, this is a very important issues that we have raised during this meeting here in Kyiv, and that I've raised when I paid an official visit to Russia last year. Roman Sushchenko was a well-known journalist. He was working from Paris, and he has been arrested and is still detained in Russia. This is not an acceptable situation, and I recall that OSCE participating states have took commitments to encourage the free flow of information, to facilitate the work of journalists from other participating states, to give accreditation, and not to arrest journalists coming from another participating state. Stanislav Aseyev was a blogger working in Donetsk. He has been arrested by the separatists outside of any kind of legal procedure, and we have asked for his release since the beginning. And Mykola Semena is now under house arrest in Crimea, and we asked that he can be able to come to Ukraine and to Kyiv freely, and it's not acceptable that he is he has been condemned and even forbidden to exercise his work of journalist. Those are also issues that we have raised in the context of a dialogue between National Union of Journalists of Ukraine and the Union of Journalists of Russia, and there was several common appeal and public statement to ask for the release of Stanislav Aseyev.
Well, the Ukrainian government is always very disappointed when the international organizations are criticizing them for the limitation of the work of some of the Russian government channels or the Russian social networks and the other things. And somehow those people who support those bans always says, but the France is looking at how to deal with the fake news, the Google should deal with fake news. For instance, the discussion on the foreign agencies taking place on the US, and the Brits are speaking about the RT. So how would you answer on that the Western governments are also trying to do something with stopping the fake news, but in case of Ukraine, there would be always some kind of the criticism that Ukraine is putting a pressure on the media.
Yes, that's an international discussion, and in all countries today there is an attempt to legislate or to look at the ways to stop fake news or disinformation or propaganda. There has been some legislation also which aim at fighting against hate speech, for example, racism, anti-Semitism, terrorist propaganda. And it's a very difficult issue because of the special dimension of social media, where you can have thousands or millions of unlawful content or in a way call for violence which are disseminated sometimes by extremist groups, sometimes by other states which try to meddle in the situation of their neighbor, of other country. But I think that we must be very attentive on the fact that first, this wording, fake news, can recover very different kind of situation. Of course, there could be also a lot of people who just put silly things on internet which are not real information. Here, I think that the real and good answer is to promote quality of information, professional journalism, to debunk fake news, to develop also media literacy, to help people to understand that they cannot take for granted all kind of news which are on internet or on Facebook or on Twitter. A second different thing is the attempt sometimes by certain states to intentionally give disinformation to try to create trouble in another country. And sometimes there has always also been the use of factory trolls, for example, and this has to be investigated very precisely. And I think that transparency here is important to know, for example, who is buying advertisement on Facebook, especially in electoral campaign. And that's a very intense debate now in the United States, where there is, you know, this investigation on what happens during the previous presidential campaign. And there is also the fight against hate speech. There is legislation which exists, and there is international law which says that call for violence or hatred against people because of their origin, their religion, their race, for example, can be forbidden. That could be legitimate limits to freedom of expression. It was already existing for printed press. Now it can be applied to internet, but we must take care that it will not be done by algorithm which will not only block and take down unlawful content, but which could also block the access to some critical voices or independent media outlets. And I'm very careful about the way some government will try to impose to social media, to internet intermediaries, more and more blockade, saying that they just fight against fake news, against propaganda or against hate speech, but in fact trying to stifle, to restrain the space for free media and for criticism. And it's very important to find the good balance, and that's also the discussion now in European countries, for example in Germany, in France, also in the United States, to look at the way you can impose some kinds of regulation to the internet social media, but protect the freedom of expression and the diversity of opinion. And I think for Ukraine also this will be a key issue. We are engaged in a discussion with the government about this issue of hate speech. We have provided legal advice about the international standards and the good practices which exist in other countries. And I think that it will be of utmost importance for Ukraine, even if I understand that the country is in a very difficult situation, facing difficult challenges linked to the conflict, linked to the annexation of Crimea, to the conflict in the eastern part of Ukraine, but to protect freedom of expression and to ensure that any legislation will not put at risk the development of free media, even if, of course, governments sometimes are upset by free media, because the work of journalists and the work of media is to criticize, is to develop critical thinking. But that's the nobility of democracy, and that's also how the public debate can progress in a country.